Hey there, I hope that you have been enjoying my YouTube channel. Today I want to do something just a little bit different. I've been providing lectures from my university classroom, and what I'd like to do today is dig into a particular topic that I wasn't able to do in the lectures, but I always have found interesting, and that is the question of Cato's suicide. So on the last lecture that I posted, I talked about Julius Caesar's civil war, and I just mentioned how Cato committed suicide, and then we just kind of moved on. But I find Cato to be a very interesting person, and I want to talk a little bit about him and get into the question of why he committed suicide, because it is a bit of a puzzle. First, if you don't know, Cato was a Roman statesman named Marcus Porcius Cato. He lived from 95 BC until his death by his own hand in 46 BC. Obviously, all of this happened during the late Roman Republic, which was a period of political instability and transition, as the Roman Republic, which had been around for almost 500 years at this point, was transitioning towards a kind of autocratic system. It hadn't yet made that leap, but at this point, strong men were operating in the Roman Republic. People like Gaius Marius, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, Pompey the Great, and now in 46 BC, Julius Caesar. And Cato was unhappy about this situation. He was a very conservative statesman and Stoic philosopher. He was unwavering, really, in his commitment to traditional Roman values. He believed that the nobility needed to have integrity, virtue, and most of all, they needed to act to preserve the Roman Republic, whatever the cost. And Cato, like I said, would commit suicide in 46 BC, not even in the city of Rome. He was in the city of Utica, which was in the Roman province of Africa. It's the modern-day country of Tunisia. And the reason he committed suicide, at least overtly, is because the forces that were opposing Julius Caesar in the Civil War, these were forces that were composed of the more conservative senators fighting to try, ostensibly, to keep the Roman Republic as the Republic and not allow Caesar to run the entire thing as dictator. Well, really the final battle of that civil war, the final meaningful battle anyway, was in 46, and Cato was there, and his side lost that battle. And then after the battle, as told by the Greek historian Plutarch, Cato has this very dramatic end to his life where he gathers his friends together and commits suicide. So to understand why Cato committed suicide, I think we have to probe first into his influences, his background, and his interest in philosophy. Cato was orphaned early on in his life. He did not actually grow up in the household of his mother and father. The man who raised him was Marcus Livius Drusus. Drusus was initially a very conservative politician, but eventually became a little bit more of a populist and an ally to Italians who were not fully Roman citizens. And I don't think Cato admired Drusus very much, probably saw him as a kind of turncoat to the conservative cause. Cato's grandfather was Cato the Censor, who was a deeply conservative man and also a brutal slave owner and governor whose career peaked after the Second Punic War in the early to middle of the 2nd century BC. That was Cato's grandfather, but Cato never knew that man. He just had his reputation. He had this almost idealistic view of this conservative grandfather that shared his name. And Cato probably wanted to live up to the example of his grandfather. Cato was also deeply influenced by Stoicism, and Stoicism is a philosophy that emphasized self-control and reason and virtue. And in Stoicism, There is this idea that one should not be afraid of pain. One shouldn't live life to avoid pain. One should also not live life. One also shouldn't live life just to pursue pleasure either. But in that kind of system, suicide is a rational choice in some extreme circumstances. And I think Cato was facing such a circumstance when Julius Caesar managed to win that civil war. And Cato, by the way, did not merely oppose Caesar out of abstract republican principles. He did not like Caesar. And we see this in numerous places. Cato just opposed Caesar at every turn. So when Caesar was consul, he tried to enact legislation to redistribute public land to poor Romans and also some of his veterans. Cato fought that legislation, seeing it as a bribe to gain popular support. Cato was also an opponent of Caesar's alliance with Pompey and Crassus. This alliance was called the First Triumvirate, and it was formed in 60 BC. Cato did not like the idea of three of Rome's leading men, all populists, essentially running the Roman state based on an informal backroom deal. Cato wanted things done constitutionally, out in the open, and he probably also thought that the triumvirate gave Caesar far too much influence and power. By the time Cato was in his 50s, he was a kind of leader in the conservative faction in the Roman Senate. And he would do anything that was within constitutional limits to oppose any populists like Caesar. So one of the things that he did often is he engaged in filibusters. He would give long speeches to try to delay legislation, especially if it was attempted by Julius Caesar. Caesar would eventually imprison Cato just temporarily for being an obstructionist. This obviously was of dubious constitutionality, but it was something also that Cato never forgot. Cato was also obviously a huge opponent of Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon, which I reference on another lecture on YouTube. You can find it on this channel. Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon River in 49 BC, and this was a pretty monumental step. Caesar was bringing an army into Italy, and this was illegal. Once he crossed the Rubicon River, he crossed into Italy with that army, and he was therefore an enemy of the state. That move launched Julius Caesar's civil war. It was an act of open rebellion, and every conservative member of the Senate at that point decided to fight Julius Caesar in the civil war. The problem was that these conservatives did not have among themselves an obvious choice for supreme commander. Instead, they had to ally with another strong man, a man named Pompey the Great, who had been an ally of Caesar, but now was on the outs with Caesar, and Pompey and Caesar were fighting for supremacy. What Cato had to do was pick the lesser of two evils. He didn't really like Pompey all that much, but he hated Caesar more than he hated Pompey, and he needed Pompey because Pompey was just a phenomenal general. So Cato sided with Pompey, as did the other conservatives, and that was one of the two sides in the Civil War, Julius Caesar's side being the other side. Pompey, unfortunately, ended up dying early in that Civil War in 48 BC at the Battle of Pharsalus. And when Pompey died, the remaining forces in the conservative faction all scattered to different parts of the Roman Empire. Cato eventually found his way to North Africa with a sizable army, and he took command at Utica, which was a port city in the Roman province of Africa, and that was where Cato decided to make his stand. He organized a defense of that city, fortifying it, coordinating with local allies there, working alongside the other Republican leaders to try to resist Julius Caesar. And they held out there for a couple of years, but then in 46 BC, Julius Caesar's forces, which he led personally in that confrontation, fought Cato's forces near the coastal city of Thapsus. And on April 6, 46 BC, Caesar won a crushing victory. He had superior numbers. He had better tactics. He was just a better general than Cato or anybody else that Cato had on his side. So Cato retreated to the city of Utica, and this was essentially the place where he just waited for Caesar to come. He knew at this point he was not going to win the war. Wasting more lives was pointless in a kind of futile opposition. So at that point, Cato had a choice. Was he going to surrender to Julius Caesar, or was he going to do something else? Ultimately, Cato rejected the idea that he would live under Julius Caesar's rule. But there were also philosophical convictions in play and Roman cultural norms and even Cato's own personal integrity. Cato's decision was practical, but it was also symbolic, and he staged it in a way that reflected his principles and ensured that the suicide would be remembered. And I think Cato was, in part, motivated by his legacy and his realization that he would have an afterlife, in the sense that his memory, and especially the memory of his final act, would live on, even if he didn't. I want to start out with Cato's philosophical rationale. So he was engaged with Stoic philosophy. And as I said before, suicide is permissible in Stoicism under certain conditions. Death was, for a Stoic, a kind of neutral act. It wasn't good and it wasn't evil. It was a legitimate choice if one could not live according to reason and virtue. And for Cato, Caesar's victory meant that the Republican cause was over. And there would be an environment, at least in his mind, where the ability to live freely without tyranny would be completely unattainable. We have an account of Cato's suicide from the Greek historian Plutarch, and Plutarch says that Cato actually gathered people around him, friends of his, people that understood Stoic principles, and he decided to talk about those principles with this group of friends on the eve of his death. He said that only the good man is truly free, while all bad men are slaves. And this is a comment which suggests that suicide would be a legitimate way to assert freedom from Caesar's domination. In a sense, killing himself was an act of autonomy against a tyrant who was about to impose a tyrannical regime. The work, actually, that Cato read during that gathering of friends was called Phaedo, which is a dialogue depicting how Socrates went to his own death in a calm, philosophical way. He accepted death as a rational means of fighting injustice. And Cato did not pick that text by accident. This was a way for him to link his own death to that of Socrates. It was a kind of martyrdom and a deliberate rejection of life under Julius Caesar's rule. But I will say one of the problems with Cato in those last hours, at least as Plutarch tells it, is that he did lose control of his emotions a little bit. So at one point, Cato tries to find his sword to commit suicide, of course, and he realizes that he can't find it, and he gets angry and actually hits a slave so hard that he injures his own hand. Plutarch records him shouting. This is behavior that Cato, as a Stoic, would have wanted to avoid. The other thing that we see in the actual death itself is a form of brutality. So Cato's death is very gruesome. He stabs himself in the stomach, and that doesn't quite do the job. And so he actually has to tear open the wound. And this is not a serene Stoic suicide. This is not Socrates drinking from the hemlock. This is Cato in agony and then enduring even more pain, which in a sense is a little bit more Roman. This has a kind of Roman valor to it, and I'll explain a little bit more about Roman ideas about suicide in just a second. It makes Cato's death not simply a copycat death of Socrates or a purely Stoic act. Cato's Romanness shines through in the way that he dies. It's also fitting that Cato dies in such pain because it's clear that just as his body was in agony, his mind was in agony as well. One of the things that Caesar did, and this really helped win him the Civil War, is that any of the enemies who willingly gave up, agreed not to keep fighting Julius Caesar, those people were pardoned. Julius Caesar was exceptionally merciful, which of course undermined narratives that he was going to be this brutal dictator tyrant. In fact, if Caesar was merciful to all of his enemies, this suggested that he was trying to be a uniter. The problem is that with Caesar's clemency came conditions. If a person owed one's life to Julius Caesar, then they were, in effect, a kind of slave to him. This goes back to Roman ideas about slavery, where slaves were captives in war, people who had once been free, but based on the rules of war, their lives were forfeit once their city was captured or their army surrendered. Their life belonged to the enemy commander. And if the enemy commander decided to spare that life, well, then those who were spared had a kind of duty to give their lives, no matter what it meant, including slavery, to the commander. And if the commander sold those rights to somebody else, they were free to do that. So Cato would be a kind of slave if he accepted Julius Caesar's clemency. He didn't want to be pardoned by Caesar. Cato had this grandfather that was conservative, was a fighter, wanted Carthage to be destroyed no matter what. Cato himself grew up in the house of a man that compromised his own principles, and Cato was not going to do that. He wanted to be a free person. This is the Roman ideal of libertas, where we get the English word liberty. This is the right to live free from autocratic control. Cicero reflected on Cato's suicide and actually said something like this. He said that Cato abandoned his life so that he wouldn't see Caesar's tyranny come to pass. And this is an act which resonated. Cato's suicide meant something to the men who survived him, especially people like Cicero himself, but also Brutus. Brutus and Cicero both wrote fawning eulogies of Cato. We don't have them, they don't survive to this day, but supposedly they portrayed Cato as a kind of martyr. The eulogies were so powerful and influential that Caesar himself, despite having ultimate power, sole power of the Roman Empire, actually had to write a treatise against Cato, trying to undermine Cato's legacy. And that work also doesn't survive, unfortunately. Cato was the culmination of all of his ancestors and his influences. He carried the legacy of philosophers, but also his grandfather, all of those generations, all of those men that had survived and had improved their lot in life. They culminated in the person of Cato. And if he were to surrender to Julius Caesar, to become a slave, it would knock the legacy that he was handed out of his hands, out of the hands of any who would remember him. It was just something that he simply could not do. And so by rejecting Caesar's clemency, staging his act as a kind of public death. He transformed himself into a symbol of republican resistance, and this would influence later generations, as well as the people alive at the time, to view Caesar's regime as antithetical to traditional Roman freedoms. Romans understood what Cato did. There was a deep-seated Roman tradition of self-killing. It was an honorable response in cases of defeat or dishonor or loss of autonomy. So the Romans have this idea of suicide to preserve honor or avoid shame. This was true at the very beginning of the Republic. The Republic was founded on a suicide, and you can watch my lecture series on Rome before it was Rome. It's a 6-part lecture series which talks about the Roman monarchy and then this suicide. Noblewoman Lucretia, the men are out to war. She's raped by the son of the king. And so in response to this, she holds a public gathering and commits suicide in a kind of public way. That's exactly, in many ways, what Cato did. He had a public suicide, only this time, instead of inspiring a new Republican renaissance, it was really the death of the Republic, despite the fact that Julius Caesar would be killed later by one of the people that mourned Cato, that is Brutus. In the end, the Republicans couldn't get it together. And so Cato's suicide, despite maybe his own hopes that it would inspire future generations to refound the Republic, didn't end up accomplishing that. Roman law was perfectly tolerant of suicide. It was allowed in cases where one was facing execution or exile or disgraced. It allowed a person to preserve honor and honor for their family. They could also commit suicide before having their property confiscated in order to preserve property and pass that on to their sons. Another way that we see Cato's suicide being in line with Roman values is the fact that it was painful, the fact that he didn't initially kill himself and he had to tear open his wound. The Romans value endurance, and Cato's death scene is almost superhuman. It's hard to imagine anybody having the degree of courage and tolerance of pain to tear open their own wound as they lay slowly dying with their blood seeping out of some open wound. That just sounds absolutely horrific. But for the Romans, this was a sign that Cato really meant it and that he was truly a strong, dedicated individual. So as you can see, Cato's suicide is a pretty complicated issue. It's got a lot of layers to it. There's philosophy, there's the defiance of Julius Caesar, there are cultural norms as well. He's obviously drawing on Stoicism. He's rejecting Caesar's tyranny at the same time, and also carrying out suicide in a way which Romans themselves would have understood at the same time. So it's a pretty effective act, and it's not surprising that his suicide would be remembered. Cato is not a one-dimensional person. He's not just a philosopher or just a politician or just some angry conservative that ranted about Julius Caesar. In the end, Cato's suicide shows that he was serious. He was a man who was navigating and witnessing the collapse of his world. And as a result, he faced the death of that world with conviction, with a bit of strategy, and a willingness to die as a Roman. All right, if you enjoyed that and want some more, please like this video, subscribe to the channel. I have to say that really helps me, by the way, if you subscribe to the channel. All right, thanks very much for checking out the video. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time. Hey, did you get something out of that video, or maybe learn something about Roman history that you didn't know before? Would you just click that like button? It's the best thing you can do to help the channel. The videos keep playing, and if you click the like button, it tells YouTube that you want more videos like this one. Maybe you have a question about what we talked about, or you know something, or have a comment that you want to share. would you please type that into the comment box? I read those comments. That means I answer questions or I listen to feedback, but also a lot of other people read those comments. And so if you want to add something to the discussion for other people, if you do that in the comments, that will help the video as well, and just it'll keep the discussion going. Finally, if you want to get these videos when they come out and not just hope that YouTube is going to tell you, you can subscribe to the channel. Click the subscribe button and you'll get the videos as soon as I put them out. They'll come up to the front of your YouTube homepage, and wouldn't that be great? The last thing that I'll mention is my podcast, the Pax Romana podcast. I update that podcast every week. We do a couple of different things. One is we go through the story of the Roman Empire from the death of Julius Caesar on a week-by-week basis, all the way through as far as you guys are interested in going. I think right now we're in the 3rd century AD. So you can listen to those as they go, almost like an audiobook. It's free. Or if you want to just dip into particular episodes, that's fine. The other thing I do from time to time on that podcast is I answer listener questions with kind of a longer treatment about some particular topic, theme, or area that listeners are interested in. So with that, thanks for watching the video and take care.